Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and I'm really excited to share today's conversation with David Michelson. David has been working on a ballot initiative in Oregon that would ban the intentional injury or killing of an animal. He'll be speaking and sharing more about this campaign at our upcoming Eugene Vegan Fest on May 3rd, 2026. So if you are in the Pacific Northwest area or can get to Eugene, I hope that you will join us and catch David at our Eugene Vegan Fest. He'll be in the Impact Room at 2 o'clock. And after talking with David, I'm so impressed with this campaign. It's really visionary. And hearing about what it would do for animals, it felt utopian. It gave me a renewed sense of hope that we can create a world without animal commodification and exploitation. It's truly exciting. And we here in Oregon could actually be voting in November on freedom for all animals in all instances. It's visionary. It's just visionary. We had a lot to discuss, so let's get right into it. I think you're going to be really inspired by David and what he's doing with this campaign. So here we go. All right, today on the podcast, we have David Michelson. He is the lead organizer behind a ballot initiative campaign in Oregon that seeks to ban the killing and breeding of all animals statewide, including those on farms, in research labs, and in the wild. David started this campaign in 2020 and is currently working on qualifying it for the upcoming 2026 election. And I am really interested to hear more about this. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you, Hope. Happy to be here.
Well, we like to start just by getting to know you a little bit. So why don't you tell us the story of why and when you went vegan?
Yeah, so I went vegan when I turned 25, and I'm about to turn 33 now. So, however many years ago that was, which isn't that many years ago. Relatively new, but I was vegetarian when I turned 14, and I think the reasons are definitely connected. When I was younger, I remember having a very distinct memory on my 14th birthday while they were, serving animals. I looked down at something I was eating and I said, I don't want to eat meat anymore because an animal has to die for that. That was my thinking at the time. And I also had some vegetarian friends, so I was familiar with what the concept was, had never heard of veganism at all at that point in time. So I think it genuinely didn't occur to me. But I do remember thinking, well, the animals don't have to be killed for their dairy and eggs. And so I was satisfied with that. And I was satisfied with that for quite a long time.
Mm.
And what eventually transitioned me to veganism, it really wasn't thinking around animals at that point in time. It was partially related to a relationship that I was getting into who, he was lactose intolerant. I was already not eating meat. He decided to give all of that up. And so we went vegan at the same time. It wasn't until after I went vegan that I started getting more involved in animal rights because I wanted to meet more vegans. And through learning about the vegan community, I came across the documentary Dominion that I'm sure many are familiar with. And
Mm.
after seeing that, I very quickly, my first thought after watching was everyone needs to see this. How could I stand in public and show people? And sure enough, there were groups doing that. And so very quickly after I went vegan, I started getting involved in animal rights activism. Yeah, it happened maybe in the reverse order than it sometimes does, but I'm very grateful that one led to the other.
Yeah. I had a really similar experience in my teens. I was sitting down to dinner. My mom had cooked a chicken whole. Sometimes people cook a chicken
Yeah.
whole, like on her side, and she served that, and I could see this chicken's little body. Like I saw her wing and her round belly, stomach, breast, whatever. And it just hit me. I was like, this is an animal. What? Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I love animals. Why am I eating animals? And I went vegetarian at 16 from a very similar experience. Yeah. Well, it's always, I think, a beautiful awakening when people make these discoveries on their own. I mean, this is not, we weren't handed a pamphlet. We just felt it in our heart, right?
Yeah, and against what I mean, the culture is definitely teaching us to look at, right? We're not in an environment that questions what we're eating. So
Right.
I'm very grateful that so many people are having those experiences despite the narrative to avoid thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. And then the dairy and eggs, it is harder because it's not as obvious, right? You think, oh, well, the cow was just milked, the chicken just laid an egg, and you don't see the
Yep.
cruelty. So that's when you have to learn more, be educated. And that's the work we're doing. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I know the logical arguments don't aren't as easily to understand when you don't have the additional information. Like it's easy to understand that when you're eating someone's body, they died in order to eat their body. But the dairy and eggs and other animal products, it sometimes without understanding extra information, it is harder to immediately see how they're connected to the cruelty that's involved in,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
objectifying them in their bodies.
Yes, well, and so we do this work, and you have found a very interesting path to educating and doing this work that I want to hear more about, and that is this ballot initiative that you have. It is IP 28 now. I think it's had different incarnations, but this is IP 28 now. The Peace Act, People for Elimination of Animal Cruelty Exemptions. And it's getting a lot of attention lately. You've had a lot of good media, even mainstream media around it. Can you tell us what it is? What exactly is it and what it would do and maybe what stage it's in now?
Yeah, so IP 28 stands for Initiative Petition 28, and that simply just means we were the 28th proposed ballot initiative for the 2026 election cycle.
Mm,
It is a proposed ballot initiative that, if passed, would ban killing animals for food, hunting, fishing, experimentation, would ban the masturbation and impregnation of animals, so artificial insemination. And it works by removing exceptions from our animal cruelty laws that currently make it so that our cruelty laws only protect our companion animals. This framework is done in most states that have cruelty laws. It's very explicit, where the law itself might start off more encompassing than it actually is, because there are a bunch of exceptions that carve out who is and who is not protected. So, for instance, in Oregon, animal abuse is defined as the intentional, knowing, and reckless injury of an animal, which is straightforward. That sounds intentional injury sounds like abuse in many ways. And yet, when we slaughter them, when we hunt them, when we experiment on them, that is intentional injury, but it isn't considered animal abuse because there's a state law that says the following list of activities are exempt from our cruelty protections, and it lists slaughtering, hunting, experimenting, etc.
wow.
The initiative quite simply removes those exceptions. That is the main impact that it has. It removes that language so that the current pre-existing definition of animal abuse is applied to all animals statewide. So it really is about extending those protections, and that's how we frame it that way, and we explain it that way, because it is pointing out to people we already treat our dogs and cats oftentimes like they have needs. We want to meet those needs. We understand that they have needs for affection, curiosity, play, safety, sustenance, and we go to usually some good lengths to meet them. And yet, all these other animals that have those same needs, we either say that they don't have those needs, or when we do, we don't care enough about them to find a way of meeting our own needs without coming at the expense of theirs, without killing them. We just don't value them the same way. And so, our campaign is really explicitly about trying to point out this distinction and to advocate for alternative strategies to get all of our own needs met without killing animals. That's the big part of our campaign. It has been through multiple iterations, like you mentioned. When it started, it was for the 2022 election cycle, and it was IP 13 at that time. And then for the 2024 election cycle, it was IP3, and then now IP 28. And each iteration, we've gotten more capacity to actually get this on the ballot. When we started, it was really just me, and then eventually grew to be 4 or 5 other people during that time. we resubmitted together, and then we continued to grow during the IP3 segment. And then we tried again for this election cycle, and now we are actually, I mean, as close as we've ever come to getting on the ballot with over 110,000 signatures right now, which is close. The goal that we need to have by the end of June, we're hoping to turn in around 140 to 150,000 because the legal number that we need is 117,000 verified signatures. And not every signature that gets turned in is verified because they're either not actually registered to vote or they were illegible or whatever the case might be. So we are very close, and yet we also still have some time ahead of us to make sure that we can get the signatures that we need.
And what's the deadline?
The deadline is officially July 2nd. Effectively, the end of June will be when we need to wrap up signature collection.
Wow, that's really soon.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, David, it's genius, really. I mean, I have to say it's genius. The cruelty laws are already there. You're not
Yes.
adding anything. You're not adding like we shouldn't do this to animals or anything like that. It's already all there. And all you're doing is taking out the exemptions for all the commercial and leisurely activities of killing animals. It's oh wow, that's really really genius that you thought of this. And also, I would think that people, I don't know, people would look at this and be like, "Well, yeah, of course. This is already stated that we shouldn't do these things to animals, that animals are protected. Why shouldn't it be all animals?" It
Yes.
seems so basic or common sense, right?
I think
Uh,
it does feel common sense to a lot of people, which is especially initially when we explain what we're doing, they want they want other animals to be protected. Most people claim to really care about animals, and I think most of the time that is really quite genuine. It's just that we're in a system that makes it far easier to kill them and to not think about killing them
mm,
than it does to think about what it would be like to actually treat all animals the same way we treat our companion animals. And so even though there's that initial sort of yeah, common sense nature to this, then when they start realizing what the implications are, it does stimulate a lot of questions and a lot of understandable concerns. I mean, we've been using the strategy of killing animals to meet our needs for a long time, and so they do genuinely want to understand how we could not do that. And that's what our campaign is largely about, is to introduce what those alternatives actually are, get people to think about what those alternatives look like, and to demonstrate that we can, if we wanted to, change our system quite radically if we decide to vote for something like this.
yeah. So my listeners will possibly know this about me, but I'm not really a fan of legislative efforts generally. And I worked on several of them. Back in the day, I was the Sonoma County coordinator for Proposition 2 in California, one of the very, very first kind of cage-free efforts, though they went about it in an odd way. But this was back in 2007, 08. So I have this long history with legislative efforts, observing these things. And I got out of them fairly quickly after working on a few. It always felt, the reason I got out of them is that it felt like a lot of energy and resources and money and time for so little return, so little and sometimes no change for the animals' lives. And now the latest farm bill includes the EATS Act and the SOB Act, the Save Our Bacon Act,
Yeah.
where these proposals would counter all of those hard fought laws, all of those, the Prop 2 and Prop 12, and all the things that we have put so much energy and resources and activist time into, they'd just be wiped away if these
Yeah.
provisions, pass in the Farm Bill. My point is that legislation feels very flimsy to me to focus on and work on it. It's always been frustrating to me that we put so much energy on it. But what you're doing is different. IP28 is different, and I believe that it's different. So talk about how it is different from our usual animal welfare legislation efforts.
Yeah, I think a couple differences come to mind, and one that in particular sort of surfaced while listening to you talk about your own experience. These ballot initiatives, or the not even just ballot initiatives, but these other reforms, they often will follow public opinion rather than lead public opinion. And and I say this to maybe give a concrete example. When I talk to organizers who are involved in these, they'll often say they won't pursue something unless it already has enough support that they know for sure it will pass.
Mm.
And the issue with that, I think, is that the reason these laws are so easily repealed by something like the Eats Act or the Save Our Bacon Act is that culture hasn't shifted enough to genuinely support these issues. I think when we pass reforms, they're less about shifting our culture to be one that actually values animals' needs so much as prioritizes our comfort and like image of ourselves. I think oftentimes when we want to treat animals better in a bigger public sense, it is not rooted in a fundamentally different consciousness that these animals have needs just like ours, and we want to value them equal to ours. I don't think it's rooted out of that level of consciousness. And I think without that, it's always going to be very easy to backtrack. And so I want to see policy that is about stimulating a shift in public opinion, leading public opinion, not something that is simply already considered low-hanging fruit. And I understand why some organizers still view that strategy as helpful. And I'll just speak to why I'm advocating for something like I'm advocating for. I
Hmm.
really want to build momentum towards asking for the world that we want and for creating that type of consciousness that I think will lead us there. I'm also very much motivated by a long-term vision of the future. And the historical example that I often give as at least as inspiration to demonstrate that this is something that's possible is the women's suffrage movement because they used the ballot initiative strategy to get the right to vote. But
Mm.
only after 53 years of ballot initiatives did that success actually come to fruition.
Wow.
And in Oregon in particular, I share this a lot. Women only got the right to vote after 6 election cycles. They got an initiative on the ballot 6 times asking for suffrage, and it was only passed on the sixth attempt. So they were persistent over decades. There were early on instances of different groups asking for maybe more limited suffrage rights, but the groups behind these statewide efforts, they were very consistent in their ask. And I think that's helpful. That's the approach I'm wanting to model. I want to continuously ask for a system that doesn't kill animals anymore. And I want to normalize asking for it now so that in decades from now, this is something that can come to fruition. And I don't think it's going to come to fruition as quickly if we're not even comfortable asking for it in the present moment.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's true. We really have to have the bigger picture in mind with all our campaigns. I mean, this is how I feel about a project or a campaign. If someone asks me, "Oh, do you think this is a good thing to work on or to do?" I ask the question, well, does it lead us in the direction of animal freedom? Is that what the end goal would be if you continue along that trajectory, right?
Yeah.
My concern is that a lot of the welfare efforts, legislative and otherwise, do not take us down that path. It
Yeah.
takes us down a different path, which is different products, different farming methods, and more money for the industry, and possibly more animals killed in the end. So that's that that's a whole thing. But I do appreciate what you said, that it's true. We have to have animal freedom as our end goal, have that big picture in sight with everything we do. And I'll also say that I don't feel that we should never have incremental change. I mean, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think that there are incremental campaigns that are helpful and that are moving us in that direction. That's the key thing, though. We got to look at where it's moving us towards. And I'm curious with the suffrage, you said it took 50 years. Was that like from the first legislative attempt and it went state by state? How?
Yeah, yeah, great clarifying question. So it was 53 years from the first ballot initiative attempt until the 19th Amendment was ratified. So obviously, there was quite a long period of time before
Yeah.
that that is not included, but just from when the first initiative was voted on. And I shared that number because I want people to realize that for our campaign, 2026 might be the starting point, even though it took 6 years even just to get to that for us. And of course, decades and hundreds of years of animal advocacy we are coming out of.
Yeah.
But it might be, I don't want people to join this campaign and think, okay, we get it on the ballot in 2026 and we've now won, or maybe we could do it in one or two election cycles. I really want to emphasize that this could be something that takes decades or longer. And that is a reality, unfortunately, of social change,
Yeah.
but one that we can still find ourselves meeting our own needs while doing the work so that we have the energy we need to keep going. I think that's one also difference with our campaign compared to at least some other reform campaigns is I noticed they talk about using victories as a form of motivation to keep going. And our campaign, of course, is not going to see a victory in the ballot box anytime soon. And so our motivation needs to be something different. And I like focusing on, are we acting out of meeting our needs by engaging in the campaign we're doing? And a lot of the times, one of the needs is met is authenticity. We're asking for the world we want, and that itself can be motivating.
Mm.
It is a different source of motivation than a victory number, a certain a win, so to speak. But I think that personally, I want us less and less to be motivated by what we think of as a win, and rather I would have us focus on what type of advocacy is meeting our own needs.
Mm. Yeah, it's the nature of our work that it is long term. It is, I
Yes.
often call it generational work, that we are possibly likely not going to see the end result of our efforts. So, it sounds like that is kind of what you are looking at is a long term campaign. I do like how you said authenticity. I really appreciate that. I feel like a lot of our efforts these days are it almost feels like we've given up that we could ever see a vegan world, and we're just like, well, let's just do what we can now. Let's just relieve a little suffering here and there or whatever. It almost feels like we don't believe it could happen. And I know that for a lot of us, we feel like, no, we can do this if we stay the course, if we tell people the truth and present what's really happening. People will, I believe very much that people will want to change, want to see change. And I think we can be honest and authentic about that and not have to hide or sugarcoat around some kind of like a lesser ask.
Yeah, we can hold on to our vision of the world in our advocacy. And I think when we let go of it, or when we choose to ask for something that we don't believe in fully, I think other people pick up on that.
Yeah.
And in our conversations with people who don't enjoy what we're asking for, which we have many people while we're petitioning who are not interested at this moment in moving away from killing animals, I do think that they haven't been able to say, we're not asking for the thing that we actually do want. And when I see them engage in conversations with other efforts, I think they will often make the claim that they're not being as forthright with what their end goal is. When campaigns are involved in reforms, I think other people are aware that in most of those instances, the reform is not the end goal, but they often don't share that so explicitly. And so there's a perception of their
Dishonesty.
tactic. Yeah, that is often the perception. And right now, in this moment in time, I think there is a it's easy to react to thinking that you're being lied to because we are in an environment where it's hard to understand when people are or are not being truthful already. There's a lot of information that is genuinely withheld from us. That is a habit that is very easy to have in this moment. And so I think being as open about what our end goal is as possible is very vital to making sure that we can build genuine coalitions and like trustworthy relationships, even with people who currently don't support what we're doing. Because I
Mm,
don't think they're going to become less resistant if we're not open with what our goal is.
yeah. So when I Googled this campaign, IP28, when I was preparing for our conversation, the top link that came up was from the Oregon Hunters Association. And they had this full page dedicated to fighting IP28, along with a video from their director. And reading this page, the initiative there was being criticized for numerous things, and among those things, it was saying that it was kind of an attack on rural life and Oregon's way of living. And I remember when I first heard about the campaign, I felt that Oregon was kind of maybe a tough sell or an unusual place to start something like this. This state is very hunting, fishing, outdoorsman kind of heavy. And I wondered if maybe somewhere that was more urban or a little less, had a little less farming and hunting as more the culture would be maybe better to start. Why did you start in Oregon?
Yeah, so the short answer is that I was simply here, living here when I got the idea to do something like this.
Yeah, well, you're a
And so,
citizen of the state, so that you
yes,
have the right. Yes.
yes. Yeah, so that's the shortest answer is it just happened to the circumstances came together so that I was here. In Oregon, we also have our cruelty laws most clearly laid out. I mean, I have looked at other states and how they word their cruelty laws. In Oregon, it was just so clear. The
Hmm.
exceptions were articulated. It was such a simple change to make to Oregon state law. And so there are some benefits, I think, that have come out of starting in Oregon, even though it wasn't an idea that I had from outside of Oregon that I brought here. And I do want people to know that it was simply I am an Oregon citizen resident, and so this is the state that I'm working to change our laws in. For what we're doing, the initiative does have to be at the state level as opposed to a local level because the animal cruelty laws are at the state level. Now, you
Mm.
could create something that gives greater protections to animals at a local level, certainly. But if we're going to remove exceptions from our cruelty laws, well, then it has to be at the level of where the cruelty laws are, which is the state. So that is
Mm.
why we are both in Oregon in particular and at the statewide level. Oregon does also happen to be a state that has a ballot initiative process that I would describe as more accessible than some other states, particularly for grassroots groups. Notably, Oregon allows for up to 2 full years to collect signatures. A couple other states do that, but many have much shorter windows, sometimes
Mm.
6 months, I think sometimes even shorter than that. And our Secretary of State has articulated the ballot initiative process in a way that I think is very accessible to people interested in engaging in this form of direct democracy, whereas other states, it's often hard to find how to get yourself involved in this process. So I am very grateful to those resources that the Secretary of State's office has provided. But it is largely in Oregon because of circumstance. And I do want to be really mindful to something you mentioned in the question, which is this being viewed as an attack on rural life. I'm particularly mindful about that urban rural divide that's not just in Oregon, but across the country. I think that is where the biggest divides are rather than individual states. It's much more often within each state, this urban rural division, both politically and culturally.
Mm.
And so, one of the ways that our campaign is hoping to de-escalate that tension is to recognize that people in all communities, but in rural communities who are involved in systems that currently involve killing animals, we really want to empathize with the needs that they're trying to meet because those needs are the same needs that everyone else in urban environments and everywhere else have needs for sustenance, economic stability, for belonging, for participating in one's community. All of the needs themselves are very important, and we want to help them as well as everyone else find other strategies for meeting those needs that still get their needs fully met and that also meet those needs of the animals. And our campaign, if passed, would set up a transition fund to help people be able to afford that shift in strategy, whether that is transitioning their farms from, chicken farms to mushroom farms, whether that is helping people with job retraining, whether that is increasing food access in certain communities, whatever the need might be, we want to demonstrate that we care deeply about them and that we're not trying to, we're not out to get anyone. We're just out to protect animals and also each other. So even though that tension is likely going to come up often when we are campaigning, we really are trying to demonstrate as best as we can that we really do care about everybody in Oregon, even those living in rural areas.
Yeah, and there's going to be that tension anywhere, right? The
Yeah.
rural urban divide, and we do in Oregon have Portland and Eugene, which are incredibly vegan friendly, progressive, and also just a lot of work in the streets, activism, change, social justice. So we have that in the urban areas, so certainly this is going to get support as well. But yeah, you're right. You're going to have that divide in any state. And, you mentioned about supporting the farmers and people that do rely on animal exploitation as their livelihood. The campaign sets up a transition fund, right? Because if this passes, this would put some in an economically challenging place, affecting their livelihood. Do you want to talk just a little about that transition fund that is proposed to be kind of helpful if this did pass?
Yeah, so we will readily acknowledge, as has already come up in our conversation, that it's unlikely this passes in 2026. We
Yeah.
are aware of that. At the same time, we would love it to pass in 2026. We'll certainly campaign for it, even knowing that it is highly unlikely that this will likely take many, many election cycles. But we wanted to draft something that, if passed, like would be genuinely helpful. And so we created this transition fund that would be overseen by this fairly large council of people that pulls individuals from a lot of different communities that would be impacted by this. And the fund could be used for essentially any purpose that aids in a just transition, whether that is for, like I mentioned, the job retraining, income replacement temporarily during that job retraining process, helping facilitate, shifting agricultural practices, increasing food access. It could be spent on animal care as well. It right now takes any funds that currently go towards an activity that would be banned if this were to pass and redirects it to that fund and gives the legislature a mandate to fund it and to identify funding streams for it. So
Mm.
it is there to give reassurance that we really do care about people meeting their needs, even if this were to pass. And that is why it's there. It's helped to support us in shifting society away from killing animals.
Mm.
And hopefully it does provide some reassurance to folks.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you included that. It's really important. So I want to talk about a different aspect of the campaign, and that is around animal sexual assault. So many people have no idea that in animal farming, male animals are masturbated for their sperm, females are regularly sexually assaulted for forced pregnancy, and under the current laws, these are criminal acts, but only if they're done for a person's sexual gratification. And I find that so interesting because, well, what about the animal? Why why is it
Yeah.
why are you even concerned about it if the same act is done to someone? What does it matter if the perpetrator has a different,
Yes.
intention, right?
Yeah.
Wow, it's just so bizarre. But IP 28 would change that. It would make sexual assault against animals, any animal, all animals, a criminal act. Can you talk about this aspect?
Yeah. So it's helpful to think about when these animal sexual assault statutes came into place, and they were largely trying to prohibit the sin of bestiality. And so it was viewed not about protecting animals, but punishing human beings who did something that other human beings said was wrong to do. And so
Mm.
it was written such that any forced contact with an animal's mouth, anus, or genitals would be considered animal sexual assault if done for the human being's sexual gratification. And like you pointed out, we would not think of that in another context where there's a clear victim. The intention of the perpetrator in most instances is not as important as the perspective of the victim in that situation. But of course, in this law in particular, there is not even, it's almost as if the state is the victim. The animal isn't even considered an entity that is worth, that has needs that we're trying to protect.
Mm.
What our initiative does is it removes that specific aspect to it where it no longer matters whether it's for a person's sexual gratification or not. If we're coming into forced contact with an animal's mouth, anus, or genitals, then that would be considered sexual assault, with the only exception being veterinary practices. So
Mm.
in that moment, we're taking into account, in theory, in perfect practice, the intention or the experience of the animal, where veterinary practices, again, under their ideal, are meant to benefit the animal in some way. And so there is that new exception, or I guess it's actually a current exception that would remain. But all of the other instances where we are masturbating and impregnating animals for our benefit, that would be considered animal sexual assault under the law if this were to pass.
Well, oh, I love that. I wish I wanted to pass so much now. I mean, I get that, you don't. Wouldn't it be amazing though? I mean,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be amazing? Ultimately, people don't want to see animals suffer. They don't want to hurt animals. I think for the majority of people, they do not want to see animals suffer. And I think when they would hear about this, like that animals are sexually, violated in animal farming. People don't know that. I think they would just be like, "What?" And that's part of the education, right? That this initiative is doing.
Yes, we want people to understand what practices really are happening to animals. Many people don't have as full or robust or a robust understanding of what these practices entail, and I think people will be understandably shocked and confused and upset when hearing about exactly what is going on, what type of assaults are happening, what type of injury is happening, what type of
Yeah,
killing is happening. I mean, our goal partially is to highlight to people what things are really happening to animals now, as well as what different choices we could be making to not have this happen if we wanted to shift society away from killing animals.
right. Right. And most people though, I mean, they're just going to sign your petition and move on. They're not probably going to get this full picture story. I mean, I think some will go to the website and be like, "Oh, what's going on?" But I don't think most will. But I'm assuming that you're going to be able to put everything in the ballot pamphlet, right? In the voter guide that goes out that people read about your side of it. Are you going to be able to put whatever you want? Are they going to edit it? How does that work? Because I'm
Yeah,
hoping I'm hoping you're going to be able to put all of this information in there, so that's where they will get the education. That's where they will learn about these things, right?
so we will be able to submit arguments in favor, but even the neutral attorney general's summary is actually quite explicit with what this would and wouldn't do. So
Really?
yeah, in Oregon, when an initiative is submitted, and once have submitted the first 1,000 signatures, the Attorney General would then go through the initiative and create a summary language called the ballot title. And that'll be both, there's a 15-word summary, a very brief one. That one's actually on every sheet that we're using to collect signatures. But there's also two 25-word summaries and an 125-word summary, and those would be sent as part of the ballot. I mean, that's what they're going to be voting on is essentially looking at these brief summaries. And even there, it points out that this would ban what are currently legal forms of injury and killing and also breeding. And it lists, right? This is what we're currently doing. And this would be voting to not do those things. So I think even the neutral summary will be quite enlightening to many people.
Wow.
But then we will
Wow.
also get to submit our arguments in favor and also get a lot of news coverage. So we did get a decent amount recently, I think because we started getting close to 100,000, and that seemed like a large enough number that some news groups wanted to interview. And when one does, all the local ones start to want to cover it as well. So we got a taste of a small taste of what I think we will get if we qualify for the ballot. And that is going to be very educational for people as well. And people who I think are sometimes hard for us within the vegan community to access. When I look at who's going to our website and when I engage with certain people, both in person and online, I feel quite confident that they have not typically been exposed to a number of animal rights arguments and reasoning because they're kind of outside our bubble in a lot of ways. And I appreciate that this is a way to maybe break through to a very broad audience if we were to qualify. I think the news coverage would be immense.
Wow, that's exciting. It's very exciting. I can't wait. I mean, I'm in Oregon, of course, and I can't wait to get my voter guide and open it up and see that in there. Wow.
Yeah, it'd be surreal. After working for 6 years to get this, if it does qualify, it'll take a couple months of additionally hard effort, but if we can get it, it will feel surreal to see it on the ballot for sure.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. Well, let's get into some of the other things that this would touch on as well, because it affects a wide range of human exploitation and the all the ways that humans exploit animals. And we've talked about farming animals, but this also would affect like management of wildlife and interventions of wildlife, like issues of overpopulation of animals, when an overpopulation and they kill animals. Actually, thinking about it, I'm just thinking about the barred owls right now, that
Yeah.
there's a proposal to kill all these, I mean, like some awful amount. It's in the tens of thousands, I believe, maybe even 100,000 barred owls in Oregon because they feel that they're pushing out the spotted owls. But of course, this is a human caused, it's not the
Yeah.
owl's fault. We've cut all their forest in the east. So the barred owls have been migrating west. And now they're encroaching on territory here because we have the forests. But anyway, that I just thought of that would possibly end the killing of the barred owls. Oh, that'd be so wonderful. But these are the kinds of things that it would affect. Also, like in our houses and our homes, undesired animals like mice or rats coming in. So just curious how this would all, how you've addressed this, how this would all affect like management of wildlife.
Yeah, our initiative does aim to take the lethal wildlife management practices, or at least so-called wildlife management practices, those lethal ones we want to take off the table, and primarily that's hunting, right? We usually use that, I would say, as our go-to wildlife management practice is we kill them because it's considered fast and efficient and relatively easy to do. And we want to say there are alternatives that we could use that don't involve killing animals. One of the most common that come up are sterilization vaccines. And this is one that is being researched by organizations that are certainly not known for being animal rights groups. The USDA has done a lot of research into multiple different types of sterilization vaccines. Other departments of wildlife management have looked into these non-lethal alternatives, and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has a webpage that talks about some non-lethal forms of wildlife management. So, these are not animal rights groups saying that there are alternatives. It's just that we're the ones saying, what if we exclusively used these non-lethal methods? And if we wanted to intervene in wildlife populations, that would present us an opportunity that would be allowed, even if this initiative were to take hunting off the table. I also do mention in these conversations that I think we intervene in the lives of wild animals in ways that we don't. I'm not as convinced that they're always in helpful ways. I think, to your point, some of the things that we do right now are contributing to the problems that we then go in and kill them for. But I also think that we have a fixation on keeping nature in sort of this very static. We want to hold nature still. And nature is a dynamic, entity. Like we are part of nature for one, and things are constantly changing. I do believe that it achieves balance over time, even if we're not intervening. I think often when we're intervening, it's to really fight against some sort of homeostatic balance that it's trying to achieve. And this is maybe beyond the scope of the initiative because we don't have a particular stance on whether we intervene in wild animals. But at the very least, if we wanted to, if we do feel convinced it's helpful, we have non-lethal ways of doing that. For mice and rats, that would often look like humane traps, like catch and release traps, essentially, which have been around for a long time. I forget, I think the first one was developed in the 1800s, or the commercially available first humane mousetrap. And we can catch and release them outside. We can find the holes that they're coming in from and patch them up. It might take a little bit more effort, but we're, putting in that effort to save someone. So I think personally, I would enjoy putting that effort in. And the people who are currently employed as essentially exterminators now, we still want them to have a job. And so their job can just shift to being more about finding where animals are coming in from, sealing up those holes, relocating animals if we don't want to do that work ourselves. There are options that we can pick. And
Yeah,
this is just
yeah.
about talking about what those options are.
Yeah, I think that that's what I mean. We call them exterminators, but they do come and do an assessment of the house and patch up the holes and all
Yeah,
of that first. So that exists and could certainly continue. And yeah, I often feel when I hear about something like the barred owls that I mentioned, or some other situation where there's some imbalance or whatever, we feel that we have to do something to help the environment, and it's environmentalists that are concerned and trying to do the right thing, that are looking for alternatives to situations in nature that we've created. But then when this the solution is, well, let's just kill a bunch of animals, it's like,
yeah,
well, I feel like there's a lack of imagination there.
yeah.
That doesn't seem to be a solution, certainly not for the animals that are being killed. So, let's find those better solutions. Let's get creative and find a way that we can help the situation and not hurt the animals. And I get your point too about maybe pulling back on so much management. That wild areas are wild without our help. So yeah. So what other misconceptions, or what other thoughts around IP28 do you want to bring up? Things that people might be concerned about if it passes, or I don't know, do you want to clear up any other misconceptions?
There are a couple other misconceptions that I think are helpful to give some clarity on, at least if people were to read what the Oregon Hunters Association or what some of the local news stations mention, they're not always as precise in their language as I think is helpful. And so it leads people to not fully understanding what this does and doesn't do. One of the common misconceptions is really around the definition of animal under Oregon state law. So in Oregon state law, an animal is defined as any mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, or fish. Notably, invertebrates are the category that are not included under that definition. So this initiative wouldn't ban killing insects or other invertebrates. Not that our campaign is in favor of killing a bunch of insects, and I think we can also, use fewer things like pesticides and etc. But it doesn't impact those animals. And I do think that it would probably be more complicated, given how many invertebrates there are and how abundant they are in our lives. It would probably be harder, the impacts that this could have. So it is helpful to clear up which animals in particular this does and does not impact. I think it's also helpful to clarify that this is an initiative that does maintain exceptions for intentional injury in both self-defense cases and also in veterinary care practices. So things like spaying, neutering, and even vet-administered euthanasia, if done by a veterinarian, would still be allowed if this were to pass.
Mm.
It would ban things like what they sometimes call euthanasia on farms, where a farmer simply kills an animal because they are injured and don't want to seek them veterinary care, either because they don't have the funds to do that or it would just not be profitable to do that. That would be banned, but veterinarians, if there are terminal animals in our campaign, understands that this is a very complicated issue, especially because we don't have the capacity to get clear consent from animals around whether they want to have their lives ended. But at least to be clear, any veterinary practice would still be exempt if this were to pass. And this also only criminalizes intentional injury. So occasionally we get people who think, oh, well, what happens now if I'm driving and I accidentally hit an animal? Have I now broken the law? And the answer is no. Our definition of abuse does specify it needs to be intentional. Just a couple things that occasionally get presented that lead to people misunderstanding just the specifics of what this does and doesn't do.
I could see possibly the opposition using unclear language or gray language to make people very concerned about things like that. So, yeah,
Yes.
that's good to clear those things up. Well, with the time we have left, I want to broaden out just a little bit and talk about something that you presented. So, on your website, you have a blog, you have articles that are posted that you've written, and you had one with an excerpt from a book called Spirit Matters by Michael Lerner. And he talked about the importance of a movement having a spiritual heart or a base that I found really interesting. The article or the excerpt goes through the trajectory of social movements and the frustration that arises as activists kind of go through the process of realizing that this is really difficult and really challenging and a long trajectory, like we were talking about earlier, generational work. And as the excerpt said, we start to settle, we start settling for short-term wins that kind of divert attention away from the bigger picture and the actual end goal of animal freedom. And I often talk on this podcast about the importance of changing who we are, not just what we do, right? Changing what we care about, what we consider sacred and worth protecting, instead of just changing our habits and eating veggie burgers. I mean, that's important too. I mean, I want us to change our habits and eat veggie burgers, but I feel like that's not enough, that we have to change who we are as people, as a species. And I thought this kind of spoke to that kind of spiritual base and heart of a movement. Do you want to talk about this post and why you shared it?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate getting to share more about this in particular because it has become a really critical foundation for the campaign. In that excerpt and in the book more broadly, the discussion is around how the shift we want to make is, like you described, one of a different consciousness where we are connected to, I would use the language of needs, our needs and the needs of others, and becoming aware that those needs are themselves connected. And I think that's probably the most spiritual component that's talked about in this work and also in the work of Marshall Rosenberg, the author of Nonviolent Communication, which is how I got to this book was through a workshop. Marshall Rosenberg mentioned this book as being one of many influences in his own development. For us, that consciousness is the goal that we're going for. And I think it touches on a little bit of what we talked about earlier, that we are wanting people to recognize animals as having needs and recognizing that we can meet both our needs and their needs simultaneously. That's different than shifting just the way that we treat animals. It's really about shifting the way we understand both animals and also ourselves as being connected to one another. Maintaining that concept, that consciousness, is, I think, what will avoid us from diverting our attention towards smaller wins because we'll see that they are not compatible. When we lose that consciousness, I think it becomes very easy for us to fall into the habit of needing this extrinsic motivator. And I really do view wins as something that is extrinsic rather than, I think, when we are connected to our needs and the needs of others, we're more motivated simply by that connection being present, and we're motivated to maintain that connection. So what he's talking about is, I think the way we apply it is when we are coming from this space of what needs are we currently meeting by killing animals? How do we find other ways to meet our own needs while also now meeting those needs of animals. Just staying connected at that level motivates us to keep going. And so we won't fall into thinking that we need a short-term victory because we're getting all of our needs met simply in that advocacy.
Mm.
I also appreciate that it in that excerpt it talks a little bit about how that will keep us from viewing others as oppositional to us in a, you know, sort of a dualistic us versus them, which is very parallel to this idea of winning or losing. I think when we maintain a particular spiritual consciousness, to use that language, we are aware that we are connected not just to the animals we're trying to protect, but also to the people who are currently killing those animals that we're trying to protect. That we have these same needs. These needs are both universal and interdependent. When we maintain that consciousness, we don't see them as being against us, and we don't see us as being against them. We can no longer imagine winning because that, by definition, means someone else loses. And so that's how those two I think initially those two lines of thought might seem separated, but that's how they are unified, that when we maintain a particular consciousness around what we're advocating for, which is this who we are shift, then we can't imagine having short-term wins because the way we define most short-term wins is in opposition to a short-term loss. Our campaign isn't about winning or losing. It is about meeting everyone's needs and evolving into a consciousness where the needs are what we focus on. And that post goes into a little bit more depth of why we've adopted that and what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, I resonate with all of that, and it's true. I've kind of been I've said it maybe a couple of times that the opposition, like people that
Yeah.
would be against this initiative. But I agree with you that it's just going to benefit everyone if we stop the violence and killing of animals. Ultimately, I mean, it may
Yes.
be some short-term pain for some economically, but ultimately, we're going to be a better world, a better society, better community with this trajectory of consciousness and compassion. And so they're not really the opposition. And it's interesting that you say that because now I've caught myself saying that a couple times. So what would you say? I don't know, the people that are against the initiative. I don't know.
Yeah, I
How
would
to,
usually try to say, I have noticed me becoming more intentional around that language, but I understand how we're using it as a shorthand. I mean, it is one word that describes a much longer sentence, and
right.
if you maintain that understanding, then I think that the word itself is not the issue. But I do usually try to say, people who don't want to see this passed in 2026 or
Mm,
whatever the
yeah.
specific thing is that they might hold at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but I really like that. I like being intentional with our language, being careful with our language. And I appreciate wanting to reach out to farmers and ranchers and hunters and anyone that may be opposed. And there are people right and left having changes of heart. There are farmers, animal farmers, that are realizing they don't want to be in that business anymore and they are transitioning out. So we need to be open to everyone being open to this message. So yeah, I love all that. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that you're thinking that way.
I'm glad that it resonates. I really am.
Yeah. Well, David, you are going to be presenting at our upcoming Eugene Vegan Fest. That's on May 3rd. And you're going to be talking about your campaign, and I'm excited you're coming down. You're in Portland, so you'll be coming down to Eugene for our Vegan Fest. And I know Portland is reviving their Vegan Fest this year, so lots of Vegan Fest energy, which is exciting. Do you like Vegan Fest? Are you excited to come down to ours?
Yes, definitely excited. I enjoyed coming down last year. There was a group of us, I think six, around six or so came from Portland together. We took the train down and took the train back up, and it was a fun time both just to be in Eugene, but also visiting other people on our campaign who are in Eugene, who we don't get to see as often as I would like. So it's a enjoyable opportunity to get to see everybody and then also just to be around a bunch of people who enjoy veganism. And that's the community building aspect of these events is to get to know and to revisit and see, friendly faces, new faces. So yeah, I definitely enjoy the opportunity.
Fantastic. And you're going to be speaking in our impact room at 2 o'clock. So if anyone is in the area, come into the Eugene Vegan Fest on May 3rd. You'll be in the impact room at 2 o'clock. The impact room is focused on the environment and animals and ethics. And we also have the vitality room that is for health and nutrition. 2 tracks of speakers all day, but you'll be at 2 o'clock. There'll also be a table for IP28 for people to be able to sign if you haven't, maybe get involved in some way if you haven't. And so how, if people are interested in learning more about the campaign or getting involved, how can they find resources and information?
I think our website has a lot of very valuable information for both learning more and getting involved. It is yesonip28.org. And like you mentioned earlier, we have a handful of blog posts that really do give a lot of depth to why it is we're doing this, what exactly it would do, how the initiative has been shaped by different historical influences. So if you are interested in understanding that, I recommend reading through those. And online, there are ways to sign up as a volunteer if you are interested in collecting signatures at any amount of time. Volunteering would be great. If someone is interested in joining us as a pay petitioner until the end of June, that's also a very helpful way to get involved. So our website is definitely a very useful resource.
Yeah, and that's right. You have paid positions to collect signatures. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we have both volunteer and pay petitioners, just to make sure people are supported who want to be contributing more than what might be feasible as a volunteer. So if that sounds like you, come and contact us.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we're going to wrap up with our last question. So, David, what gives you hope for the future?
I really like when thinking about this question, a quote that is from, I think it was Roberto Unger. It was that hope is more the consequence of action rather than its cause. And the reason I enjoy that is because I have noticed in myself feeling more hopeful the more I've gotten involved in advocacy. The more that I do, the more action that I take, the more hope that I have. When I'm talking to people while petitioning, I've never felt more hopeful. And
Mm.
so that is what's giving me hope for the future is the interactions that I'm having with people, the awareness that I am myself taking action and contributing towards this long journey. And so that is what gives me hope is simply the actions that I'm taking towards trying to make the world what I think would be better.
Well, you're not alone. A lot of us think it would be better with all animals free. So, wow, I'm really impressed, David, with your work, with this campaign, with this vision you have. I mean, it's visionary what you're doing. It's very exciting. And I'm so glad that you are doing this, and I can't wait to get my voter pamphlet and read all about it. I hope so much that you're able to get it on the ballot. Good luck, and thank you for all this good work.
Thank you, Hope. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. Just a reminder that David will be speaking at our upcoming Eugene Vegan Fest on May 3rd, 2026. He'll be in the Impact Room at 2 p.m., so you can hear more about the campaign and ask questions directly. So I always ask my guests at the end of the interview what gives them hope for the future, and it reminds me to find those glimmers of hope. But this campaign, this ballot initiative, this to me is a bright ray of hope. It is really a bold vision, asking for what we want, not being afraid to insist on total animal freedom. And yes, there can be effective incremental ways to get us there. I think we need to really analyze carefully each of those campaigns to be sure that they are leading us in the direction of animal liberation. But let's not be afraid to talk about or to hide the end goal, right? In any campaign, in any program that we're engaged in, let's be honest and direct in our advocacy for animals. How will anyone know what we're truly asking for, a vegan world, if we're not honest about it? This campaign, it just gives me a lot of hope that there are young people, fairly new vegans like David, that are holding the vision of a world free of cruelty, free of animal commodification, where animals are free to live their lives without human imposed suffering and killing. I'm 37 years vegan, and I still believe that a just vegan world is possible. And it takes bold campaigns like this one to get us there. So be sure to sign if you're in Oregon to get the initiative on the ballot. I've got a link in the show notes to the campaign website. So go there, see what you can do to help in this last month of campaigning. Know that what we're fighting for can be possible. Hold the vision and live vegan.